Most of us know the 23rd Psalm. It is fairly common in Christendom and all of the Christianity. Following that is Psalm 24, and Psalm 24 in verse 1 and 2 identifies that the earth is the Lord's and all that is within it, the world and all who live within it. The psalmist writes that the Lord owns all of it. Everything on the earth, everything below the earth, everything within the earth, and all of us that are in it. So the sense of ownership comes from the Lord. He's the one that created us. He's known as the creator. So he's the creator of the very assets, the earth. To us, we are an asset unto him. And later on in the book of Haggai, the silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord. They were having a little problem. They thought that they owned and worshipped the silver and gold in their days, and he had to send the prophet Haggai to level what's known as the oracle of judgment against them. And so the Lord reminded them that, hey, the very things that you worship, I created them, they belong to me, therefore you should worship me and not the stuff I gave to you. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that you are not your own. You were bought and paid for the price. So there again, our sense of ownership is to be given over to God. I think Paul uses an analogy, don't take this the wrong way, but he says we are enslaved to Christ. We are born enslaved to bondage to sin, and by accepting Calvary and the redemption of the Lord, we become submitted and enslaved to Christ. That's a good thing. And in Deuteronomy, one of my favorite, Deuteronomy 8, remember the Lord your God. He is telling through Moses to all the people of Israel, for it is God who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So not only does God own all of the stuff, but the talents, the abilities, the knowledge bases, the things from the Lord that allow us to do what we do are from the Lord. The parable of the talents, it was the master who dispensed the talents to the servants, to the workers, to the managers. So the talents were first owned and contained by the master to be dispensed at his will. The Lord tells us in 1 Corinthians that he gives spiritual gifts as he wills. It is he who dispenses them as he wills. What he thinks is fair and what you think is equitable are two entirely different things. I always go back to Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord and all that's within it. Put that phone down, please, while I'm chatting. The world and everything contained within it, every piece of life, whether it be an animal or a human being, or a tree, or even dirt, which is a living organism. All of that is owned by the Lord. And we soon realize that we are just here at his bequest, at his bidding, and we get a better handle on that, what real ownership is and what management is. We are here to manage the resources that God has dispensed into our lives and in the purview and the purvey of our lives. And then I think you'll be on a better track, what is known as the path of righteousness. Let's go to the Lord, the creator and the maker. So Father God, we thank you for bringing us together today. And we acknowledge that it all belongs to you, resources, Lord, natural resources, man-made resources, talents, spiritual gifts, the blessings, the spiritual fruit. It's all yours, Lord. And we're just here to manage it and do it well and do it properly and do it righteously unto you. So groom us as your stewards, groom us, Lord, as your financial leaders, groom us, Lord, as your laborers in your vineyard. And Lord, help us to do it well and do it right unto you. So give us right perspective. Give us eyes to see how you've designed it, and may we come to know through the grace and knowledge of the Lord, you more, Lord Jesus. In your name we pray, Lord. Amen. So today I want to talk about, I'm going to begin to move into a two-section. This particular section is a study of finance in collegiate sport, and then the next section is a study of finance in professional sport. And there are several things that will cross over between the two terms and concepts that are important to where we're going and what we're doing. So let me lay some foundation today and begin to start threading it together before we get into the next PowerPoint. And that always helps us when we have a better understanding of some of the things we're going to be speaking about. And so when we get into college athletics, we're going to study not only the organization, the NCAA, and not only the conferences. We're also going to study the individual institutions. And in particular, within the institutions are the athletic departments. Now, we'll contrast that with, similarly, when we get to professional sport, we will look at what are known as the sport properties. A sport property is the organization, the NBA. We will also look at the individual franchises. And within those franchises, the revenue generating sources or components. So in similarity, we will look at the larger macro organizations, whether it be the sport property or the NCAA or the NAIA or the NCCAA. Those are all minor macro organizations. And they have conferences under them, and those member institutions are members of the conferences and then members of the national organizations. On this side, on the professional side, the individual franchises are owners and the operators who are a part of the sport property. And so we'll talk about their membership, how a franchise is a member of and in relationship to the individual sport property. And you really got to get a handle on that relationship to then understand the relationship between the owners and the franchises to the sport property. But at the same time, you have to differentiate that each individual franchise runs its operations as a private business or a private entity. So therefore, these individuals are what we call privateers. That's a good thing. On this side, however, the athletic departments and the personnel that run the athletic departments are employees of the institution, so they're not necessarily privateers, although they do operate in some regards as privateers. You'll see the crossover as we go through that. So we'll focus in the next couple of weeks on the collegiate model and getting a better understanding of governance and membership and organizational layout, then helps you bear down in and drill down in and understand the overall financial implications and applications. We will then do the same thing in the sport property area. Now, one of the biggest differences between the two is the corporate structuring. The corporate structuring is probably one of the biggest differences. And when we understand the model of corporate structuring assumed by the entities, that helps us then understand what their financial model is. So 99.9% of all collegiate athletic related entities are non-profit. Contrast that with 99.9% of all entities in professional sport are what you'd call for-profit. So right away, the corporate structuring, the structure of the organization, begins to lay out the financial parameters, the financial limitations, the financial model that the organization must operate within. There are laws that govern for-profit corporations that are entirely different and antithetical and completely opposite in some regards to the same laws that are just applied differently to the nonprofit organizations. And so I have to be able to help you see the difference and differentiate them in such a way that you understand them, to then know why we charge student athletic fees here, and why we can do this and why we can do that, and why things are tax deductible, and why we seek donations over here, but over here, why we do things differently and dissimilarly than the collegiate athletic environment. So some of the ways we do finance in college athletics, or some of the ways we do finance in professional sport, is directly dictated by the corporate structure that we are under. And the corporate structure then requires us to operate in a financial model in such a way that we meet IRS codes and guidelines and EEOC codes and guidelines and NLRBA, and there's all these different agencies that govern the way we do business within the organization. But stripping all that aside, we're going to start with collegiate athletics. And we now recognize that most of collegiate athletics is of the non or not-for-profit corporate structuring. And so therefore, the tax codes, the financial modeling obligations, the sales tax and property tax and all of those kind of things, the methods and manners of receiving and recording donations and sponsorshipping and charging fees to students and how we write those down and record those, all of those things are governed by the tax laws laid out for nonprofit organizations. Now they're pretty much simultaneous, they're pretty much similar from state to state. So depending upon whether you're in Hawaii or Wyoming or Florida or South Carolina, those not-for-profit tax codes are largely state and federal codes. Now, from state to state, although the states have different constitutions, and each constitution lays out its own internal tax code, the only taxes, for example, you're going to find different from state to state would be the sales tax and the property tax. So the sales tax and property tax between Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, you'll find differences in the codes and in the percentages, but the same method is true. There are certain sales taxes we're required to pay as a nonprofit institution, and there are certain sales taxes or property taxes that we are released from. Part of that's dictated by the federal government, and part of that is pretty much standard for nonprofit organizations. So there might be subtle differences in the statutory codes from the different states. In the end, overall, we're going to look at where the similarities are and dissimilarities as we go forward. But the truth is, some of the things that the North Greenville Athletic Department pays for or does not pay for might be very dissimilar to a private Christian school in Hawaii or in Alaska or in North Dakota or right below us in Georgia. And those similarities or dissimilarities are worth knowing and understanding, as long as you understand the concept and know where to find them. Some of the tax-related fee differences are going to be nominal at best. But if you are an athletic department that generates tens of millions of dollars, there might be a little bit more of a significance. And so we just want to keep that in mind. One of the things we're going to see in collegiate athletics is the notion of subsidy. To subsidize. When you hear the term subsidy or subsidize, what's something you might think of? Somebody raise their hand and tell me. Yes. A loan? Possibly. A subsidy could be in the form of a loan. What's another one? Raise your hand so I call it. Yes, Josiah.
Like when a government wants to bail out a company, they'll give it a subsidy.
Okay, so, government support. What is another thought you have when you hear the notion of subsidy? Yes?
Tax write-off?
A tax write-off could be for a for-profit, let's say a tax abatement. Let me explain that since you mentioned that. So when a community is attempting to lure a business to come to its community, a lot of times they will offer, if it's a large enough business that brings a lot of business and there's a lot of dollars related to that, and a lot of people, a lot of times the community organizers will offer tax abatements. That means they may lower the tax rate for that business, or they may defer and push the taxation back a number of years, allowing that business to get established. So for example, classic example is about 30 years ago when BMW was looking to come to build its North American headquarters. Spartanburg and Greenville put together a proposal to bid on it. There were 4 or 5 locations in all of the U.S. And they had a 20-year tax abatement where they didn't require personal property, property taxes and sales taxes and something else for the first 20 years of BMW, as long as BMW would show that they're hiring more of the local workers on a routine or regular basis. So the community said, the county organizers said, we'll push off for 20 years you paying any local tax if you hire our local people. And that was one of many examples of concessions that the community offered BMW in order to bring them here. So that's a form of tax abatement where you push it back a number of years. So that eventually expires, and then I think at the 20-year mark, BMW started to pay whatever tax it was that was pushed back. So that's an abatement. Subsidy is, well, is anybody else? When you hear the word subsidize, when you're subsidized by your parents, yes, Josiah?
Is the stimulus check a subsidy?
Well, it is, yeah. Let me check, yeah. When you're subsidized by your parents to go to school, they're doing what for you?
They're paying for you.
They're paying your bills. So a subsidy is someone else footing the bill. There we go. A subsidy is a form of support, sponsorship, the funding of. In some regards, somebody else is taking care of your obligations. So your obligations are deferred. They are transferred. They are assumed. Deferred means pushed back. Transferred means to someone else. Someone else is required to the transference and assumed. So like when your parents co-sign on a loan for you, your parents are assuming partial responsibility. If you were to default yourself, then it would fall on them. They would assume all the responsibilities. So that's an assumption of risk or assumption there. Transference, now that's a good one. For example, we have education majors on this campus, and they will graduate, and some of them might go to work teaching in Greenville County. Now, Greenville County would approach them and say, so-and-so, if you teach for us full-time for the next 9 years, after year 2, we will begin to pay off all your student loan debt over the next 7 years. And when you have reached the 9th year, we will have paid all your student loan debt off. So as long as you stay with us, you're transferring the obligation of your student loan debt to me after year 2. So that means you make the first year or 2 payments. I can see that you're going to work for us. And then from years 3 to 9, which is a 7-year period, we will assume we will have transferred the obligation to pay for that, and we will pay for those. And as long as you stay on for 9 years, then we will have paid off your student debt. So it's really a great trade. If you leave here, if an education major leaves here and they got, let's say, $70,000 in student loan debt, and you make nominal payments in year 1, year 2, and then you get the Greenville County education system to take those payments and pay those off for you, you can imagine whatever you make a year, let's say you're making $40,000 a year, and your student loan debt payment for that year is $8,000, you're actually making $48,000. They're just taking $8,000 and paying that. Now, it's not hitting your account, you're not receiving it, so it's an indirect benefit that you're directly experiencing, but that's a transference of obligation. So when someone subsidizes you, there's a number of ways that can occur. In college athletics, we're going to learn there's a lot of subsidy. There's a lot of dependency. There's a lot of supplementing that goes on. As you will quickly find out, and maybe you did already through that one little exercise I had you do about 2 weeks ago, we will quickly realize that most athletic departments in and of themselves lose money, and lots of money, on a regular basis. And therefore, they must be subsidized in order to stay afloat. Because they can't float themselves, therefore they must be blown up by the institutions funding them to be able to support their endeavors. So the little reading I had you do and the 6 or 7 question exercise was a kind of a starter point from about 2 years ago. And we'll look at some more current NCAA statistics. They don't really change a whole lot. Basically, coming out of that, you might have noticed that a majority of all of the D2 and D3 and JUCO and private institutions lose money, and lots of money, in college athletics. And only a handful of the D1s, of the 115 or 120 Division Ones, only the top 30, maybe 35 or 40, actually break even or make the money in the athletic department enough to support its living. So when you put all those institutions together, and there's 1,200 or 1,500 institutions, you find that 90 to 95% of them lose money, and lots of money, in and of themselves as an individual department, and therefore they must be subsidized. So we're going to learn a great deal about where the subsidies come from, how they're supported, and how they fund their endeavors, and why they continue to do that. Do you have a question for me?
Yeah. Has there ever been a study done on NCAA colleges with football programs, not just taking into account the money they make from ticket sales, but also the students who would not have been there if there wasn't a football team?
Yeah, so you include all of those factors. So we will look at, for example, successful football programs that grow the student body, and what percentage of the student body is enhanced, or what percentage of private giving is enhanced by a successful D1 athletic program. So that would be what you'd call an indirect benefit. What is the direct benefit of having a successful D1 program? What is an indirect benefit? A direct benefit would be the branding. So every time Ohio State's on TV, their brand profile rises. Every time Clemson is on TV, their brand profile rises. And so that brand is recognized by students who could care less about football but want to go to that school. So brand awareness, brand recognition, brand equity are generated by successful national programs that get national profile. So that's a good example of that. But again, you have to have those avenues or vehicles. You have to be on TV a lot. You have to be on radio a lot. You have to be on satellite a lot, enough to benefit from brand equity. But that is a benefit. We will talk about those, yes. But we're talking about real dollars here and not some of the other factors here. So when we go through this particular segment, we will also look at and come to an understanding of where the money comes from and where it goes to, and how it's best utilized to run your athletic departments to be able to make them as efficient as possible. The second thing we want to look at is all the revenue sources that an athletic department can take advantage of. Which ones are the most prominent? Which ones are relegated by what division you're at, for example. And so when an athletic department operates, they obviously have ticketing, for example, but not everything sells tickets. So you might think, well, ticketing is an important aspect of collegiate athletics. Yes, but most of the athletic programs in an athletic department don't even sell tickets to the events. Half of the teams don't even host events. When the golf team goes and plays, or when the track team plays, they're not even offering ticketing sales to watch those events. It's not like you're going to the Masters in Augusta, Georgia to watch the golf tournament. So when we talk about ticketing, we have to realize that there's only actually a handful of collegiate athletic sports that sell tickets, that offer tickets, that create the production value in venues to be able to watch, where we can have a ticketing example. But certainly ticketing is one we're going to look at. And then in the context of the venues, you have your venue revenues, which is food and beverage, F&B, your merchandise. Food and beverage, merchandise, parking. And yes, there's ticketing, and then there's a handful of smaller ones in there as well, like program sales. Some institutions might still sell hard copies of program. For those institutions that have the opportunity to be able to do some broadcast rights arrangements, you have your broadcast rights. I'll just use the word agreements or arrangements. My handwriting is terrible. But that would be for institutions that have an ability to put content on television or radio or satellite or internet or some virtual outlet where people would actually watch it, whether they subscribe to it or they pay for it. And interestingly, we'll also look at in particular how conferences, for example, or even private entities are now creating their own media outlets. So the Big Ten Network, ACC Network, so that would be a conference that organizes the packaging of its sporting events into its own subscriber-based network, and you have to join to watch. So you pay subscription fees to watch the content that they offer. Or even individual institutions. I'm pretty sure Notre Dame and or Texas. So Texas has the Longhorn Network. Now again, that's an anomaly. There's fewer than majority. There's few to no schools that actually have their own media entity. Texas Longhorns and the Longhorn Network would be one of the few. But we are going to look at that, so we would see that as a case example for us. But beyond that, most institutions, at least in the athletic department, have an ability to sell sponsorship. That's been a staple in athletic departments for more than several decades. Now, whether you're a small institution like North Greenville or you're a larger institution like Clemson, there's always an ability to sell sponsorship to your local and your regional advertisers. We don't really have the brand power or the reach to be able to attract national advertisers. It's not that we can't approach them, but they won't even let us in the door, and you have to understand that. Why is it that national advertisers partner with some institutions and not others? Now, once you understand that, then you'll know why we'll never get them here, and it's not the case that we don't try hard. It's not by might, not by power, but it is by the nature of the business relationship. But certainly sponsorship and broadcast rights, but also even local television revenues. There are television revenues that can be had when coaches have their own coaching shows or they have their own radio shows, and those are funneled through the athletic department. That sometimes those arrangements are made by the athletic department and the revenues come into the athletic department, and then the athletic department determines how to best dispense them. We're going to take a look at, obviously, donations, and those would come in the form of individual, commercial, which is corporate, and through your athletic foundations. And the athletic foundations are one we'll spend a little bit of time on, because there's a lot of public information on the various athletic foundations. And we'll have a little exercise in here where all of us will go and look at some finances of our favorite athletic department. And we'll take a look at that favorite athletic foundation as well. And we'll be able to generate some information about that. Because most of those are, because the institutions are nonprofit, they're required to have some degree of what's called public disclosure, and that's probably another good term you need to use. Nonprofit entities, no matter what field of business, even churches, for example, are required to have a level of public disclosure of their revenues and expenditures and their financial decision-making, their management decision-making, so that the supporters, whether it be a foundation like the Cancer Society or your local church or a nonprofit institution, they're required to have a certain level of public exposure and a disclosure of their information so that the public can ratify and justify and see how decisions are made inside that organization, how money is allocated and spent. It's required by the IRS in their nonprofit corporate structuring to have those made available. So most of the time, organizations will post on their website like an annual business meeting, the minutes of the meeting or the annual report for the annual business meeting. And then you can go into that. You can go into the somewhere, it'll be found somewhere where your athletic departments and your institutions will post that information. Now there's organizations in the community, there's organizations in the community at large that actually gather that information and report on it. So if you're really interested in college finance, the Folks Report, I'm not sure it's how you spell it, ULKS. They've been doing reporting on collegiate finance for about 20 plus years. And they go out and gather all the NCAA and conference-related information, individual institutional information, and they put together massive reports. Now, they're actually hired by conferences and by the NCAA, by organizations, to pool together the data and then make assertions and assumptions and then make graphs and tables and help us in management and leadership make decisions based on qualified data. But there's a lot of data out there that you can use to kind of help gain a better understanding. We're talking about revenues in collegiate athletic environment. Most of your athletic foundations will have dues. So to join the Crusader Club, there are multiple levels. To join the IPTE Club, to join the Paladin Club, there are different levels that you could come in at and join, and then there are additional benefits to that, and that money then goes to support the athletic department. There's dues for the foundations. Most of these institutions charge, the athletic departments charge the students a student athletic fee. Here at North Greenville, it was $35 is it a semester or a year? I think it was a year. In Texas, the Texas Longhorns charge $500 a year, and that's a couple years ago. So those may have been adjusted. They need to be adjusted based on inflation rates, and every so often they're just adjusted because the institution wants to raise the fees because the cost of doing business escalates in the athletic department. So it'd be nice for you to go back and investigate your tuition, room and board statement, your itemized statement, and actually see if that charge is still $35 or has it gone up ever so slightly. We do, in athletic departments, we have event fees. So when we host events, like let me see, this past weekend we hosted a women's volleyball invitational, and each team that came was required to pay an event fee to get in. So I don't know how many teams were here, 6, 8, 10, 12. They all paid X amount of dollars to come and participate in this event. When we hold our golf tournament for the men's team or the women's team, it's an invitational. We charge each team a set amount. Maybe it's $1,000, maybe it's $1,500, maybe it's $2,000. And the athletic department pays that for the team to be in that invitational. So whoever's hosting that event gets to collect that revenue from that, and it helps run the event, but then it helps to support the athletic department. So anytime there's an event fee, That goes into the athletic department. Now, I'd also tell you, we also host events that are outside of our own athletic department. So every time we host a conference event, or every time our facilities are rented, during the summer, you'll see a lot of baseball games played on our baseball field, and that is a form of facility rental. And anytime we can use our paid-for facilities and our facilities to host other extraneous organizations and derive revenue and benefit from that, it's a good thing. We have these facilities, let's use them, and let's make money from them. Some institutions today, particularly at the high school level, but some of the smaller institutions today are now charging participation fees. You've heard of the notion of pay to play, and in high schools, because high school athletics has gotten so expensive, and high schools are cash strapped. Remember, we talked about scarcity. Most organizations don't have a plethora of money. Most all high school athletic departments are cash strapped, and they don't all have foundations or PTAs that are working in their favor, so they've had to resort to charging for the pay to play or the participation fees. And we've even seen that at the collegiate level. There's been a time or two here that I've been aware of where a club would require team members to sell a certain number of articles, and if you didn't, then you were required to buy them, and that would be your form of remuneration back into the club, which is a form of pay to play or a participation fee. It's just spun off in a sales expectation. Yes, Josiah?
Is there a category for getting paid to compete? So instead of event fees or participation fees, where we would pay someone to use their facilities, like with the Citadel, we're getting paid, I think, $12,000.
Yeah, so that's, what's that called? That's, yeah, that's in here. I haven't gotten down there yet.
Oh, my bad.
No, you're good. I'm glad you mentioned that. What is the name for that? I'm trying not to go off my list, but I do need to stay in order. On a larger scale, we have the things that the NCAA or the conferences provide. So for example, they provide distribution, or expense monies every time a team makes the playoffs. So when the football team or the baseball team makes the playoffs, there's a certain amount of money that's distributed to the athletic department to support that team making the playoffs. If you're not aware of this, all of Division II and all of Division III athletics is actually funded by the March Madness basketball tournament and the bowl games. And so when we get to go somewhere because we made the NCAA playoffs, they're actually remunerating our expense to go to that location and to stay there and do that. And so there's a certain amount of expense money that's recouped. Now, those revenues for us as an expense for the NCAA through the form of a distribution are paid for by the NCAA. The conferences even have the same things. They do distributions and take care of expenses for playoffs or postseason play. But on top of that, if you were to win, and this again is those very few big schools, but if you win March Madness or the farther you advance, you actually generate a little more revenue. And the winners of bowl games obviously get a larger stake of the what you'd call the pie. And so there are rewards that are granted by the NCAA and or the conferences after March Madness and after the Bowl Championship Series and the bowl games. Now, a lot of times those monies go to the conferences, and then the conferences subdivide them equally. They, through parity, will equally subverse them down to the schools. So in the Big Ten, for example, if 6 or 8 teams make the bowl games, or 6 or 8 teams make March Madness, a lot of times those distributions go to the conference, then the conference subdivide them across all 14 teams. And so sometimes that's how that works. Now, if you win the bowl game, the individual institution gets to reap the benefit of that, but all the other ones go in the form of equal distributions. And the NCAA and the conferences, they have forms of grants that institutions can apply for, and grant money can be allocated to individual institutions or even to individual teams or programs. And Josiah, let me just add in there, we call those paid games. I don't know if Florida State paid for that loss this weekend, but the paid games are usually when you're paying a team from a lower division to come and play you because you couldn't find a school in your division to play during that scheduled contest. So a lot of times then the athletic department has to pay for a lower level institution to come just to fill the schedule. So bigger institutions don't always like to do that. Smaller institutions like us, we like to do that because those revenues go right into the athletic department. So when you're a new program or you've stepped up to a new division or you're trying to build the revenues in your program, it's okay to subsidize those with a couple of paid games. And so that's not uncommon for smaller institutions like ourselves to seek paid games to be able to put them on our schedule. It's not always beneficial to the larger institutions to subvert a significant or normalized game and pay out for a game that has little consequence in the greater scheme of things. So there's detriments and benefits to be had on both sides of the equation. One thing about donors, you should just note, there are donors that love to support the entire institution. There are donors that like to support just the athletic department. There are donors that like to support the individual program. And then there are donors that occasionally support just a specific coach. And so you have different, let's call them levels or classifications of donors. Some donors like to gravitate toward one particular sport. It's a sport they play, it's a sport they love. As they've done well in their own personal life, they like to support. Maybe it's their alma mater, or maybe it's just that sport at their alma mater. So it is interesting. We go after donors that'll give to North Greenville. We go after donors that'll give to just the athletic department. We go after donors that'll give to the soccer and lacrosse programs. And we go after donors that might support just us traveling to a single event. So Dr. Battenfield is trying to raise money right now so he can take his men's volleyball team to one particular event, one match. I think it's James Madison University. And so there's a cost for his team to travel and do that. So he's trying to raise money for that one event. But he's also trying to raise money for his volleyball program. At the same time, the athletic department is trying to raise money for all its operations. At the same time, North Greenville Institutions tries to raise money for all its operations. So you can have different levels and classifications of donors who will contribute and sometimes itemize or specialize their contributions for something so minute as a single trip to James Madison, or a single program like women's soccer, or just the macro, hey, I want to give to the Crusader Club just for athletic scholarship, or let me just give to North Greenville because I love the ministry and mission of North Greenville. All of those are understandable. What's fascinating is donors all have different points of interest. Us in the athletic department, for those of us who are doing development or seeking donations, we actually have to determine what those points of interest are to be able to offer the right program to those potential donors. Now, before I move on, again, this is just simply macro overview. We'll dive down into micro. Is there any questions about revenues before I erase the board? You sure? Shaking your head really hard. You're positive. All right. So he'll ace the quiz tomorrow, guys. That's what he's telling us. He can't wait to take it right after class. grade that everybody put the pressure on him. So whatever grade you earn, we all earn. I wonder how his confidence is feeling right about now. I can hear him praying right now for the mercy of God. On the expenditure side, there are two types of expenditures we're going to look at in particular throughout the course of the study of college athletics. And the predominant ones you're probably most familiar with are just the typical expenses. And the ones that you're probably far less familiar with is the atypical. Expense. And Nolan, what's the difference between the two? So make sure we're all on the same page here.
Typical would be something that you're expecting possibly.
Okay.
It occurs every year. No.
Okay, go on.
Versus atypical, like a field goal post breaking, which you wouldn't expect. Maybe,
All right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Routine expenses, power bills, salary. The replacing of the supplies that our athletic trainers use in the athletic training room. Because they use supplies are perishable. We know that every quarter we've got to replace supplies in the athletic training room. Those are very typical, routine, ordinary expenses that we incur on a regular basis. But they don't always have to be monthly expenses. So a routine expense could also be that I have to pay for my membership to the NCAA. And so I only make one payment a year. It's one large payment a year. It comes every year at the same time. We're required to do it. We do make that payment. But it is expected, it is normalized, it is annualized. It just comes once rather than on a frequent basis. So whether it comes on a more frequent basis or a less frequent basis, we know we have an expectation. The expectancy is that that comes every year. I build that into my budget. So one of the ways to differentiate typical expenses is, it is those things that I budget for on a routine, regular basis. Because I know I have paid them in the past, I will pay them in the current, and I can budget to pay them in the future. The atypical expenses are exactly as you described. They're what I would call very uncharacteristic. The surprises. And that's not a fun surprise. So what would be an example, class, if you just raise your hand, what would be an example of an abnormal, uncharacteristic, unroutine expense? Yes, Jesse.
The athletic department gets sued.
Okay, yes, we don't ever expect that, we don't ever hope that, we don't ever want that. But in the advent that we have some litigation, and we have to hire attorneys, and we have to go, and whether or not the case is dismissed, or there's a settlement, or we lose the case, yes, that you never expect that. Your insurance will cover some of that, but you are gonna be involved, you'll have to pay those bills. That's a good one. Did you have another example?
Like a water pipe busting?
Yeah, so when you have a crisis or an emergency, when you have a death on the field or a significant injury where somebody is hospitalized for 6 months to a year, paralyzed, when you have a significant breakage in a facility. A number of years ago, we had, I'll use a macro example. A number of years ago, we experienced in one of our facilities some settling of the ground underneath some seating sections. So without naming the facility, we had one of our facilities that has seating, it was basically sinking. And that caused us a major liability. The potential was it could sink down too quickly and people could get harmed. So we had to hire some geotech engineers to come and drill down in under that portion of seating and figure out where the sinkhole was and how deep it was and how wide it was. And then we had to hire a concrete company to come in and pour hundreds of yards of concrete under that seating section to be able to build a foundation to support the full weight of whatever number of people would be sitting on that, to basically prevent it from ever settling again. Well, that cost us tens of thousands of dollars. We didn't budget for, we didn't plan for, we had to take out of reserves, and it was very maddening. It's nothing you could have done about it, no matter how much work on the front end before we ever built that facility, because that facility was there for a good while. It's just an unfortunate, uncharacteristic example. Does somebody have another atypical expense?
We have like a goalpost gone up now.
Okay, so anything that gets broken that you're anticipating would last a long time. Yeah, if a GoPro's got broken, that's not a routine expense that we're fixing or replacing once a year. That'd be a good example. Yes, another one.
Could it be something that's like not, like bad?
Yeah.
So like if you wanna like go to an event that you don't normally go to?
Absolutely. Let me just, a crazy example, if our men's volleyball team starts out 20-0 this year, and they look like they're gonna go to the national championship, and Dr. Battenfield was to go to Jan McDonald, our athletic director, and say, hey, we really wanna go to this tournament in Hawaii, we think we can win it, and here's our case, and we've raised the money in our club, and here's our case, and she says, you know what, due to the circumstances, we're gonna let you go, it costs you an extra $20,000. So in that instance, it's an abnormal occurrence of an expense, that is a good thing. A new program, start a new program. Maybe we start esports, or maybe we add a tumbling team. Costs money, gotta hire a coach, gotta have supplies, gotta give scholarship money. So to roll out a new program, to hire an assistant coach. Maybe the track and field team has been winning for so long that Cameron Stober, our coach, goes to Jan McDonald and says, I need another assistant coach. She says, you know what, you've been winning a long time, you bring in 60 people, you got a new coach. So a new position requires new monies. So the add-on of a new position is atypical and unexpected, and that would be a great example. How about all this COVID stuff we're going through? 2 years ago, we weren't paying for and we weren't dealing with all this stuff. Now all this stuff has hit us, and we've been forced to do this and this and this. It requires more time and attention, more time out of you, more time. Well, there's cost built into that. Somebody's paying for this, and it's being subsidized and offset. But the institution itself, there is cost we're incurring doing that. We never would have thought of it. We didn't plan for it 2 and 3 years ago. We probably budgeted for a little bit more of that this year, but yes. So some of it's crisis driven, some of it's advancement driven, some of it's development driven. If I need new equipment, so if your coaches decide they want new equipment for the training room, new equipment for the strength conditioning center, if we decide it's time for a new training room or a new practice facility, we need to go find the new monies for that. All of those would be expenses that are atypical, that we don't normally bank on, we don't normally look for. 1205, I can keep having so much fun. I have to be careful here. What we like to do in business is normalize expenses. That's a great term I'm going to use often. To normalize expenses means that we basically average out, or we get the actual amounts, or we subdivide the amount into equal payments, whether it be every month or every quarter or every so often, whatever that scheduled payment is, so that we know what that amount is, so we can bank on that amount as we budget, as we manage the cash flow, as we oversee the budget and the cash flow. The more we can normalize expenses and expect these amounts to be what they are, it is easier for us to be able to see whether or not we're running a deficit or we're running a surplus. A deficit meaning I need to go find more money because I can't even afford to pay the bills I have. A surplus is I'm paying my bills and I have something left over on the back end. That's a good thing. So we in finance and in management like to normalize, so a mortgage is normalized. When you get a mortgage for a house or a car or a boat or something that you're gonna have a mortgage, you're gonna have the same payment, same time every month. So that's called normalization of that expense. And when we can normalize, sometimes utility companies will let you go on the equal payment plan. So if it costs us $1,000 a month to use utilities in the athletic department, if we can set that at $1,000 every month. In some months it's $1,010, in other months it's $950, and at the end of the year they settle us up. But if I know it's gonna be the same amount every month, then I can manage the cash flow and manage the budget a lot easier, and it allows me to be able to do more as we go through the process. So managers love to normalize expenditures because it really helps us manage with a lot less stress and a little bit more information. Now, we are gonna talk about debt. The pros and cons to debt as we get a little bit further in. But understand that debt is the borrowing of money from some entity in order to pay another entity, and then you're obligated to make the payments on the indebtedness. So most of the time, athletic departments are gonna have debt when they build facilities. They're gonna have debt when they roll out new programs and need to build or renovate facilities to support the facility side of those programs. We never borrow money for human resources, we never borrow money for standard operations, we never borrow money for many of those things, insurances, things like that. Our operational revenues need to pay for our operational expenditures. But when we have to add an addition or renovate a facility or build a new facility or expand because we're adding new programs, usually it's in the form of those facility structures where there is some form of plausible commodity that the bank can have a lien on. They can have a lien against our facilities. That's where then we borrow money to do things. So we'll talk about the notion of debt, owing money to somebody else, having a lien against that, paying it off, and then the more you pay off, the more equity you gain, the greater amount of ownership you have. We're gonna get to a point where we have a debt conversation, and also we're gonna get to a point where we have an inflation conversation. Those will be fairly deep, and therefore you'll be able to know all the ins and outs of those. But the inflation conversation is understanding why the cost of goods go up or down, or they stagnate, and what is stagflation, what is shrinkflation, what is deflation, and how can all those occur even in the context of one another, and sometimes simultaneously. How can you have cost inflation and dollar deflation at the same time, which is thereby one going up, and while the other simultaneously goes down, and then the beta is the difference between the two. Now, that's a little more into economics, but a good financial steward at least understands the economic impacts of economies and things in the marketplace as they affect us. If the dollar goes down and the cost goes up, then I have to figure out as an athletic director how to make more money, how to bring more money into the athletic department, because the cost of doing my athletic business is going up. And therefore, if the cost of doing my athletic business is going up, I better generate more revenues to spearhead that or meet that, or I'll continue to see a deficit. Now, this is Josh, my work study, and he's getting ready to come in to take the video production for us. So why don't we just wrap up? Are there any questions about anything else that I've shared with you today? In Blackboard, for Module 2, there is a terminology page, and usually I add to that and update that. I was doing that this morning. You can download that over the next couple of days. We're going to do the first PowerPoint on college athletics starting Thursday. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank